"You don't belong at this table, old man." My daughter-in-law said it loud enough for the whole banquet hall to hear, loud enough that the string quartet actually stopped for half a beat before picking back up. I set down my water glass, folded my napkin, and said, "You're right. I'll go." 20 minutes later, when she found out exactly who left the building with me, she wasn't laughing anymore. Before I tell you how a quiet man's 30 years of patience turned into the coldest kind of justice, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe a family isn't measured by the size of its house, hit that like button and subscribe, because where I come from, respect is earned at the kitchen table, not bought at the country club. My name is Walter Grady. I'm 61 years old, and for most of my life I ran a small fleet of delivery trucks out of a gravel lot in Scranton, Pennsylvania. My wife Eileen and I built that business from a single rusted-out van in 1994, and we built it on one rule. You never let anyone see you sweat, and you never let money change the way you look at a man who's still learning how to stand on his own 2 feet. That rule got tested harder than I ever expected on the night of my son Michael's wedding rehearsal dinner, sitting in the corner of a dining room at the Hillcrest Manor that probably cost more for one evening than I paid for my first house. I want you to understand something before I go further. I did not raise Michael to be cruel. I raised him to work with his hands, to say please and thank you to the men who empty the dumpsters, and to never assume he was better than anybody just because his father eventually did well. But somewhere between community college and his job at that downtown investment firm, my son started apologizing for me. And that night, sitting at a table dressed in linen so white it looked like it had never been touched by a human hand, I finally understood how deep that apology had gotten. The room was full of orchids, flown in from somewhere warm, crystal stemware catching the light from chandeliers the size of Volkswagens, and 40 or 50 guests I'd never met in my life, all of them talking about ski trips and second homes like it was the weather. I wore my navy blazer, the one I'd had since Eileen's funeral 6 years back. It still fit fine, it was just old. Across the room, Michael sat beside his fiancée, Brooke Sinclair, a woman with a laugh like a wind chime and eyes that measured every room she walked into like she was pricing the furniture. "Is that really his truck parked out front?" Brooke said to her bridesmaids, not bothering to lower her voice. "The one with the primer spots? I nearly asked the valet if we needed to call a tow." The bridesmaids laughed. Michael, sitting close enough to touch her, looked down at his plate and said nothing. That silence sat in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. I had taught that boy to ride a bike. I had sat up 3 nights straight when he had pneumonia at age 6, sponging his forehead with a washcloth while his mother slept for the first time in 2 days. And now he couldn't find one word to defend the truck that used to carry his Little League equipment every Saturday morning for 8 years. What Brooke did not know, what Michael himself had chosen not to tell her, was that the wedding she was currently enjoying was not, in fact, being paid for by family money, as she liked to describe it to her friends. 2 months earlier, Michael had shown up at my door looking gray in the face, admitting that a temporary cash flow issue meant he couldn't cover the deposit on the venue. To save his pride, and because I loved him more than I loved being right, I quietly wired $11,000 to the Hillcrest Manor's events office. I told him to let Brooke believe he'd handled it. I thought I was protecting his dignity. I didn't yet understand I was financing my own humiliation. After the dinner plates were cleared, Michael caught me by the coat check, and for one foolish second my heart actually lifted, because I thought my son wanted to thank me. Instead, he asked for another $9,000, this time for the honeymoon upgrade Brooke wanted. When I told him no, that he needed to learn to build a life within his means, his face changed in a way I'd never seen. The panic dropped away and something colder took its place. "Brooke already warned me about this," he muttered. "She said you get weird about money because you're getting older. Keep your savings, Dad. Just don't expect us around much once we're settled. Nobody wants to explain a beat-up truck to their friends forever." He walked back into the party and left me standing alone in the hallway. The words "getting older" rang in my ears the way an insult does when you realize it isn't really about you at all. It's the first brick somebody's laying for a wall they intend to build later. I needed air. I couldn't walk back into that dining room and sit among those people for one more minute, so I turned and pushed through the heavy service doors that led into the hotel's working kitchen. The moment the door swung shut behind me, the chaos of a commercial kitchen swallowed the sound of the party, whole pans hissing, line cooks calling out orders, the clatter of steel against steel. And the instant I stepped inside, the whole room seemed to still. The executive chef, a big, broad-shouldered man named Tomasz, wiped his hands on his apron and came straight toward me. "Mr. Grady," he said, and there was real respect in his voice. "Is everything all right, sir? Would you like your private table set up in the back?" "Everything's fine, Tomasz," I said. "Just needed a quiet minute. Carry on, all of you." The staff nodded and went back to work without a second glance. That was the second secret Michael didn't know. When Eileen and I sold our trucking business 12 years ago, I didn't retire. I quietly invested in a hospitality group that, over the last decade, had grown to own 6 regional event venues across 3 states, including the very ballroom my son's rehearsal dinner was being held in. I didn't just support the Hillcrest Manor. My holding company owned it outright, along with the catering staff, the valet contract, and every linen tablecloth in that building. I wore flannel and drove an old truck because I never once forgot the men and women who load trucks for a living, and because quiet money makes a lot less noise than loud poverty pretending to be rich. I stood in that kitchen sipping a glass of water when the swinging doors burst open again. Brooke stormed in, cheeks flushed with fury, holding a crystal wine glass in her hand. She marched straight toward a terrified young server who could not have been older than 19. "Do you have any idea?" she shouted, her voice bouncing off the stainless steel. "How much my future husband's family is paying for you people to work tonight? I ordered a Sancerre, and you brought me a Chardonnay. Are you incompetent?" The girl's eyes filled with tears as she stammered an apology. Brooke shoved the glass into the girl's chest hard enough to spill wine down the front of her uniform. Tomasz looked at me, his face pale, knowing full well I'd witnessed the entire exchange. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I simply patted Tomasz on the shoulder and walked back outside into the night air. The last piece had fallen into place. I wasn't dealing with an ungrateful son anymore. I was dealing with 2 people who believed my money gave them the right to treat working people like furniture. The next morning was the wedding itself. I arrived early and found Brooke on the phone with her hairstylist, and when she caught sight of me sitting quietly on a bench near the entrance, her face twisted into irritation. She hung up and marched over, her silk robe trailing behind her. "Walter, we need to fix one thing before the ceremony," she said, her tone falsely bright. "I've spoken to the photographer. You'll be sitting in the 4th row during the vows. The father of the groom usually sits in the front row." "Brooke," I said gently. "Michael already told me you'd understand," she snapped. "I won't have your shabby little look wrecking the front row photographs. Do you understand me?" I felt something settle in my chest, not anger, but a cold and total clarity. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a thick white envelope and held it out to her. Her eyes lit up instantly with pure greed. She assumed it was the $9,000 Michael had asked for the night before. She snatched it from my hand, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. "I'm so glad you finally came to your senses, Walter," she said, tapping the envelope against her palm. "Sit in the 4th row, keep your mouth shut, and try not to embarrass us." I nodded slowly and stood up. "Enjoy your wedding, Brooke." Then I turned and walked toward the ballroom. She didn't know it yet, but she had just taken possession of a canceled check and a handwritten note, the first domino in what would become her total and complete unraveling. The reception that evening was a spectacle of excess. String lights hung from oak beams, a 12-piece orchestra played songs I didn't recognize, and towers of white peonies sat on every table so tall guests had to lean around them just to speak to one another. I was seated at table 16, precisely where Brooke had ordered, tucked into the farthest corner beside the kitchen's swinging doors, where every server that pushed through sent a gust of hot air and the smell of seared meat across my dinner plate. The distant cousins seated with me spent the whole evening complaining about the humidity and ignoring me entirely. That suited me just fine. I watched Michael laughing with his groomsmen, holding a glass of scotch that cost more than my first car. There was a nervous energy around him, though. He was performing wealth for a room full of people who only cared about his wallet. I knew the truth. I knew his accounts were nearly empty. I knew he was drowning in debt he'd never told anyone about. And I knew my quiet sacrifice had been the only thing keeping him from complete ruin. But I kept my silence and simply watched the waiters move through the crowd. They knew exactly whose signature was on their paychecks. The music slowed into a soft ballad, and Brooke wove her way through the tables toward me, clutching that white envelope in her right hand, her knuckles pale from gripping it so tight. As she got closer, her fake smile for the guests vanished, and her eyes locked onto mine, full of pure venom. "You are an embarrassment," she hissed, low enough that only our table could hear, though our table had already gone dead silent listening. You've been an embarrassment since the moment you walked into this club in that cheap suit. Michael is humiliated by you, and honestly, I don't blame him. He told me he hates bringing you around his real friends because you have absolutely no class. Those words were meant to break me. She wanted to watch a father crumble at the realization that his son was ashamed of him. But that particular pain had already passed the night before. Now there was only the cold, steady understanding of consequence. I'm sure Michael said plenty about me, I answered, my voice level. But class was never about the suit a man wears or the car he drives. Class is about how you treat people when you think you hold all the power. And you've shown me exactly who you are tonight. She let out a short, cruel laugh. Who I am? I'm the woman taking your son far away from your pathetic little life. We don't need your money, Walter. Michael's got plenty coming in from his investments. The only reason you're even at this table is because I felt sorry for you. I wanted to give you a chance to prove you belonged in our world. Instead, you proved exactly the opposite. I glanced across the room. Michael was watching from the bar. He saw his new wife leaning over my table, saw me sitting there absorbing the abuse, and just like the night before, he turned his back and pretended not to notice, taking another sip of his expensive whiskey and laughing at something a groomsman said. He was making his choice in real time. You're right about one thing, Brooke, I said, my voice dropping to something quiet and even. That canceled check doesn't make me powerful. It was simply a test to see whether you valued family over a beautiful vacation, a test to see whether my son would defend his father. You both failed. She straightened up, smoothing the bodice of her wedding gown, her face twisting into a mask of pure disgust. I'm done playing games with you, Walter. Get out of here. And don't come back because you are not welcome here. The orchestra seemed to fade into the background as those words landed on the table. She stood there, chest heaving, waiting for me to argue, to beg, to make a scene. Instead, I did the opposite. I set my cloth napkin down gently on the table, pushed my chair back, and rose slowly to my full height. I was taller than Brooke, and when I stood, she instinctively took half a step back, though she tried to maintain her posture. I looked down at her. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I simply looked at her with the calm, knowing expression of a man who has already won and hasn't told you yet. I buttoned my jacket, smoothed the lapels, and turned my back on her, walking not toward the front exit, but directly toward the swinging kitchen doors. The kitchen greeted me with heat and the smell of roasted garlic. Dozens of cooks and servers moved in a tightly choreographed rhythm. Near the prep station stood Diane, the general manager of the venue, who had worked for my holding company for almost 14 years. She wiped her hands and came toward me with a look of quiet concern. Mr. Grady, she said, is everything all right out there? Do you need the private room? Diane, I said, my voice calm but carrying weight. The groom and his bride have just informed me I'm no longer welcome at this event. They've ordered me to leave the premises immediately. Diane blinked, her professional composure slipping for just a fraction of a second. Sir, this is your building. Your company owns the entire hospitality group. They can't possibly ask you to leave. They don't know that fact, Diane, and I intend to honor the bride's request to the absolute letter. I'm leaving right now. But as the sole owner of this operation, I'm implementing an immediate and total shutdown of every service for this specific event. Diane didn't hesitate. She simply straightened her collar and nodded with complete loyalty. Understood, Mr. Grady. What are your exact instructions? Every staff member gets paid in full for the entire weekend. Nobody loses a single dollar over my family's dispute, but I want this entire hall shut down right now. Kill the music, pull the food, pack the instruments. We're walking out. Diane nodded once more, pulled her two-way radio from her belt, and pressed the button. All staff, this is Diane. Code black on the Grady Sinclair reception. Cease all operations immediately. Set your trays down. Step away from your stations. We are clearing the floor. I walked back through the kitchen doors and into the ballroom one last time. I stood near the edge of the dance floor and waited. The orchestra was in the middle of an upbeat number, couples spinning under the lights. I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers once. It wasn't a loud sound, but Diane, who had followed behind me, saw the signal and pointed sharply at the conductor. The music stopped cold. Not a graceful fade, the drummer's hands froze mid-beat. The horn section lowered their instruments, and the lead singer pulled the microphone away from his mouth. The sudden, deafening silence that dropped over that ballroom was staggering. Hundreds of guests stopped dancing and looked around in confusion. Some laughed nervously, assuming it was part of the entertainment. But the silence stretched, heavy and wrong. Then the exodus began. Across the room, a server carrying a silver tray loaded with filet mignon simply stopped walking, set the tray down on the nearest table, and walked away. Another server set down a tray of champagne flutes and turned his back. One by one, the staff abandoned their posts. The synchronized clatter of trays and dishware being set down echoed through the frozen room. At the bar, the situation was even more dramatic. Michael stood there waiting for a refill of his scotch. The bartender, a longtime employee named Reggie, looked at his radio, then at Michael, and without a single word, took the bottle of premium whiskey off the counter, screwed the cap back on, and locked it in a case beneath the bar. He then began locking the liquor cabinet, the heavy brass padlocks clicking shut one after another. "Hey, what are you doing?" Michael demanded, his voice echoing awkwardly in the quiet room. "I asked for a drink." "Open that back up." Reggie didn't even look at him. He wiped down the marble counter, folded his towel, and walked out from behind the bar, joining the growing line of staff gathering at the rear of the room. Michael stood there, his face flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and confusion as he watched the mass walkout of people he thought he was paying to serve him. Brooke was still standing near table 16, exactly where she'd left me. Her arrogant smile had vanished, replaced by pure confusion. She watched servers quietly untying their aprons and packing instruments into heavy black cases. She looked toward the confused guests, now murmuring anxiously to one another, demanding to know why their half-eaten courses were being cleared. "Michael!" she shrieked, whipping around to search the room. "Michael is the owner of this event. He paid for this. Michael, get over here and fix this right now." Michael ran toward her, looking completely helpless. He pulled out his phone, desperately trying to call someone. I stood near the main entrance, adjusting the cuffs of my faded jacket, feeling a deep and profound sense of calm. Diane stepped up beside me, and the remaining staff lined up behind us, standing with quiet dignity, refusing to serve a couple who had treated working people like dirt. I began walking toward the tall double doors leading outside. Brooke chased after the last of the staff. "Walter, what have you done? Tell them to come back." "Michael, do something. Make them come back." "Dad, please wait," Michael called after me. "What is going on? Why are they listening to you?" I didn't stop walking. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the lobby and stepped out into the cool, refreshing night air. The staff had already returned their keys to the confused guests, beginning to wander out of the ballroom. I walked down the curved stone path to the far end of the parking lot, where my old pickup sat waiting in the shadows. I unlocked the heavy door and slid into the driver's seat, the worn upholstery familiar against my back. Inside the ballroom, Diane was the last one remaining. She stood near the main electrical panel at the back of the hall, looked once at Michael and Brooke standing in the middle of the wreckage of their reception, surrounded by ruined food and bewildered guests, and reached out to pull the heavy lever of the main breaker. Brooke let out one final, piercing scream of pure panic just as the lights went dark. The massive chandeliers, the accent lighting, the stage lights, all of it died within a fraction of a second. The country club sank into total blackness. I didn't drive away right away. I sat in the far corner of the parking lot, hidden by the shadows of old oak trees lining the property, and watched. The grand entrance doors of the club burst open, throwing light onto a chaotic sea of confusion. Men in tuxedos stood in the cold, women's dresses shivering in the night air, everyone talking loudly about the ruined evening. Without valet staff to retrieve their luxury cars, a long line formed at the entrance like stranded birds scattering in the morning light. Inside the quiet cab of my truck, my phone, resting on the passenger seat, lit up. Michael's name flashed on the screen. I didn't pick up. I simply watched it ring until it went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, it lit up again. Then again, a dozen calls in rapid succession. I let each one ring through with a slow, steady patience. It was remarkable how quickly his tone had shifted from arrogant dismissal to panic pleading. The man who refused to defend me against his wife's cruelty now demanded I rescue him from the consequences of his own cowardice. I leaned back against the headrest and exhaled slowly. I felt no pity. Pity is a luxury reserved for people who make honest mistakes, not for people who calculate your worth based on what they can pull from your pocket. When the voicemail icon finally appeared, I picked up the phone and pressed the speaker button. I wanted to hear his voice clearly. The message began with a heavy, ragged breath. "Dad, what the hell did you just do?" Michael's voice came through in a frantic rush. The entire staff just walked out. They cut the power. The catering manager left. We're standing here with no food, and half the guests are already driving away. Brooke is locked in the bridal suite having a total breakdown because her parents' friends are demanding answers. You need to come back here and fix this right now. Tell whoever you paid off to turn the lights back on. There was a brief pause on the recording while someone screamed at Michael in the background. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its panicked edge and shifted into a pathetic attempt at intimidation. "Listen to me very carefully, old man. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. You don't just get to shut down a wedding because your feelings got hurt. We had a verbal agreement. I'm going to sue you for breach of contract. I'll drag you into court and make you pay for every dollar of damage this venue is going to charge us for. You're going to pay for ruining my wedding." The voicemail clicked and ended, leaving a hollow beep. "My son wanted to sue me for breach of contract. He wanted to legally hold me responsible for the outcome of an evening. He was so blinded by his own sense of entitlement that he failed to grasp the scope of the situation. He believed the Hillcrest Manor was some untouchable corporation that would surely penalize whoever ruined their event. He didn't realize he was threatening to sue the corporation. He didn't realize he was threatening to take his own father to court over a contract his own father owned. I started the engine and pulled out of that parking lot, leaving the dark building behind me one last time. The real battle was just beginning. I got home a little after midnight, took a hot shower, and slept 8 solid hours. A clean conscience is the best sleep aid a man can ask for. My peaceful morning was interrupted by an aggressive knock at my front door. I didn't rush. I set my coffee mug down carefully, smoothed the wrinkles from my flannel shirt, and walked the short hallway, already knowing exactly what waited on the other side. Michael and Brooke stood on my small concrete porch looking absolutely disastrous. The polished image they'd projected the night before was completely gone. Michael wore the same rumpled shirt from the previous evening, his collar loosened and stained with sweat, his eyes bloodshot and wild. Brooke looked even worse. Her elaborate bridal updo had collapsed into a tangled mess of extensions and bobby pins, her heavy makeup smeared beneath her eyes. "What were you thinking?" Michael demanded, not bothering with a greeting. "Do you have any idea what you did? You made us the laughingstock of the entire city. You humiliated us in front of everyone who matters," Brooke hissed, her voice dripping with entitlement. "We spoke to my uncle, who works in corporate litigation. He said you verbally agreed to fund this wedding, and you breached a contracted event. You're entirely liable for the financial fallout. We're going to drain every last cent of your pathetic little savings account." I stood there and let their threats roll off me like water off a stone. They were so predictable. I turned and walked slowly back into the house, leaving the front door open. Michael and Brooke exchanged a look of triumphant satisfaction, believing they'd successfully broken me. I walked over to the small entry table where I kept my mail and important documents, and I picked up a thick manila folder my attorney, Gordon Ashworth, had couriered to my house the night before. I walked back to the front door, folder in hand. "Look, Michael," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "This is the master service agreement and venue contract for the Hillcrest Manor. Turn to the last page. Look at the signature line." Michael tore through the heavy pages, his breathing fast and shallow. Brooke leaned over his shoulder, scanning the page. There at the bottom, beneath the signature line, was a title: Chief Executive Officer Walter J. Grady. Michael's face drained of all color instantly. His hands began shaking so violently the paper crinkled. "I don't understand," Brooke whispered, devoid of her usual arrogant edge. "Walter Grady, that's you. How is your name on the ownership contract for the country club?" "Because I own it," I said. "I own the catering company. I own the entire venue. Every staff member you insulted last night works for me. My private company was billed $50,000 in penalties for last night's shutdown. Since you broke the code of conduct laid out in that same contract, Michael, since you're a signatory on the original agreement, you owe me the $50,000. And since you bragged so much about your investment gains at dinner, I expect full payment within 30 days. Michael's legs looked like they were giving out beneath him. He grabbed the wooden railing of my porch to steady himself, the heavy contract sliding from his trembling fingers and spreading across the concrete steps. "Dad, please," he begged. all the arrogance wiped from his voice. "We don't have $50,000. We're completely broke. We put the entire honeymoon on credit cards. If you enforce this debt, you'll bankrupt us." I looked down at the son who had threatened to let me rot in a cheap house. I looked at the woman who demanded I hide in the back row of her wedding. I felt absolutely nothing. "Then I suggest you call your uncle and hire that corporate attorney," I said quietly, "because the debt is real, and my collections agency is relentless." I stepped back inside my modest home and closed the heavy door, turning the deadbolt with a hard, definitive click. I walked back to my kitchen and picked up my coffee mug, taking a long, satisfying sip. Through the sheer curtains, I watched the scene unfold on my front lawn without needing sound to understand the scope of their unraveling. Michael paced in tight, panicked circles, kicking at the loose gravel near my driveway. Brooke had sunk down onto the porch steps, gathering the scattered pages of the contract with trembling hands, staring at the signature block like it might rearrange itself if she looked hard enough. I decided I wasn't quite finished. 2 days later, my attorney called with a discovery that turned my cold anger into something far colder. Gordon's forensic review of Michael's finances had uncovered a personal loan taken out against a small rental property that had belonged to Eileen before she passed property. She had specifically willed to remain untouched, a piece of her own mother's legacy meant to pass eventually to our grandchildren. Michael had forged my signature as co-trustee on the loan documents to pull out $95,000 funneled through a private lending company to cover a down payment on a condominium. Brooke had been pressuring him to buy behind my back, all while he still owed me the $50,000 from the wedding. I sat at my kitchen table with the forged documents laid out before me, and I felt no rage this time, only a flat, permanent coldness settle into my bones. Walking out of a wedding reception was a family dispute. Refusing to fund a honeymoon was a hard lesson. But a forged signature on a loan document tied to my late wife's estate was a crime. Michael had committed fraud against a federally insured lending institution, and he had done it to protect a lie he was telling a woman who, as it turned out, had secrets of her own. Gordon's team had also traced 5 separate wire transfers moving out of Michael and Brooke's joint account over the preceding 2 months, each one labeled as vendor deposits, none of which had ever reached an actual wedding vendor. The money had gone instead into a private account registered under Brooke's maiden name, Sinclair, at a bank in the Cayman Islands. Brooke had been quietly embezzling nearly $30,000 of what she believed was Michael's family fortune before they'd even finished exchanging vows, betting that Michael was too desperate and too easily managed to ever notice. I called Gordon back that evening and asked him to prepare 2 separate files, one documenting Michael's forgery against his mother's estate and one documenting Brooke's hidden overseas transfers. I didn't want the police involved yet. I wanted them both in the same room, believing they were coming to negotiate a settlement, so they could watch the full truth of each other fall apart in front of me before any hammer came down. 3 days later, they sat across a long conference table from me in Gordon's downtown office. A detective named Ruiz seated quietly to my left. Michael's face went the color of ash when he saw the badge. Brooke demanded to know what was happening, insisting they'd only come to discuss unfreezing their accounts. I slid 2 folders across the polished wood. Michael opened his first, his hands shaking as the evidence of his forged loan documents stared back at him. Then I slid Brooke's folder across, and she opened it to find the wire transfer records and the account registered in her maiden name. "You stole from me," Michael said, turning on her, his voice cracking with a fury that had nowhere left to hide. "I forged my own father's name to buy you a condo, and you were stealing from me the entire time." "Don't you dare," Brooke spat back. "You told me you had investments. You lied to me from day one." Detective Ruiz let them tear into each other for a long moment before finally standing, unclipping a set of handcuffs from his belt. Michael was arrested that afternoon on charges of forgery and identity theft against his mother's estate. Brooke, facing charges of wire fraud, later accepted a plea deal that kept her out of prison, but left her working a retail job in another state, her name quietly attached to a story that followed her online for years. I drove home that evening in my old truck, the same one that had once been mocked in a parking lot, and I sat on my back porch as the sun went down over the same gravel lot where Eileen and I once parked a single delivery van 30 years ago. I felt no lingering anger, no need for revenge beyond what had already been set into motion. I had simply protected what was left to protect, and let the truth do the rest of the work on its own. True class, I've come to understand, was never something you could buy at a country club. It's something you either carry quietly in your bones or you don't carry it at all.